In the previous video, we looked at what awakening really is and why it shouldn't be confused with a simple spiritual opening. As long as you're not awakened, your sense of self is still at the center of your experience. You identify with it and it's in control, even if you don't notice it. That's why you can feel drawn toward all kinds of experiences that actually have very little to do with awakening. And this brings us to a crucial point: the spiritual ego. When people first get into spirituality, it's incredibly easy to get misled. One of the most common traps is the feeling that you're being guided by something invisible. You start noticing signs, synchronicities, repeating numbers, coincidences that feel too perfect to be random. Little by little, you begin to believe that something or someone is guiding you. An angel, a loved one who passed away, the universe, God. And sometimes you even start to feel like you've been given a special mission. Maybe those things exist, maybe they don't. That's not really the point. The real trap is when all of your attention gets absorbed by that world. Once that happens, there's no space left for awakening. Another trap is believing that what you're going through is unique, that your spiritual opening is exceptional, that you've been chosen, that you're somehow different from everyone else. Of course, that feels good to the ego, and that's exactly why it's dangerous. Because in reality, what you're experiencing isn't exceptional at all. Millions of people go through the same stages. It's human, it's universal. If you're not careful, you might even start to feel superior. You think you're more aware, more advanced, more awake. You might even appear humble, but only on the surface. There's another very common trap: believing your ego is gone, that you now live in unconditional love, that you've reached the end of the path. So you tell yourself, that's it, now I understand. I'm at peace, I'm awake. And then sooner or later, your old patterns come back. Doubt creeps in again, the suffering rises back to the surface, and you're left wondering, wait, is that really it? Because in those moments, you're vulnerable. And that's when the spiritual ego comes back in and pulls you even deeper. You might start seeking out psychics, mediums, energy healers, or people who claim to work with the invisible. You may find yourself watching videos about heavy energies, cosmic cycles, or galactic beings coming to help humanity. And then there's the ultimate trap, the one that can keep you stuck in a spiritual prison, becoming convinced that you're awakened when you're not. If you confuse spiritual opening with awakening, you stop moving forward. You believe you're already there, so the path ends for you right there. This is something you really need to understand. A truly awakened person doesn't feel the need to say, "Hello, I am awakened." They don't need to talk about it. They have nothing to prove and nothing to show off. Why? Because you're awake, there is no longer a me trying to put itself forward. But these traps don't appear by accident. They follow a very simple logic. When you go through a spiritual opening, your awareness starts to expand. You move from a life centered on yourself to something much bigger, like the universe, non-duality, unconditional love, or the feeling of being connected to everything. And the ego doesn't want to disappear. It just wants to stay at the center. It wants to take control of this new, bigger inner world. At some point, if you begin to see that the self is leading you into a dead end, that's when awakening becomes possible. But before that happens, chances are you'll go through several crises. One of the first risks is intense anxiety. You may feel like you're dying, like everything is becoming empty, like nothing makes sense anymore. It can be terrifying. But that's not necessarily a bad sign. It may simply mean that your identity is starting to loosen, that your sense of self is no longer at the center of your world. Another common sign is a gradual withdrawal from everyday life. You may feel the need to go out less, to distance yourself from certain relationships, or to slow down at work. Sometimes your friends are the ones who pull away, and that can trigger deep wounds: rejection, abandonment, betrayal. What might look like depression or isolation from the outside can also be a sign that your ego is panicking, because it senses that it's no longer in control. so listen carefully. In those moments of crisis, you either let go and move toward awakening or you stay identified with the self. But let's be honest, most of the time the self wins. Why? Because you still don't know that something else exists beyond all of this, because you've never experienced life without being identified with the self. And sometimes, simply because the time hasn't come yet. Understanding these traps is essential, not to judge yourself, and not to make you feel guilty, but to help you see clearly where you are right now and how much of the path is still ahead of you. In the next video, we'll look at the states of being that support awakening and the ones that make it impossible.